some of the issues that you're seeing, I mean, we've had COVID now for a while. That has an effect on kids and being able to not go to school, or being able to go to school wearing masks, having plastic dividers, not being able to play with friends, et cetera. What are you seeing on the front lines? You're watching this every day.
So the mental health needs of kids have been increasing for years. The pandemic has exacerbated the problem. We've seen the trend lines now take a steeper pitch, right? And those needs are becoming much more obvious. But the mental health needs of kids have been sort of woefully unaddressed or underaddressed for a long, long, long time. It's tough. Some kids have those experiences that you just described. We might call those adverse childhood experiences that are dramatic, right? That's a particular event that happens at a moment in time that is stark and clear and traumatic. And certainly there are a lot of kids that face those. A lot of other kids, though, are dealing with mental health issues and struggles that aren't so apparent. There might not be one obvious cause or event like that triggers something. And yet there can be a progression and development of symptoms and issues that signal a mental health crisis that's coming down the road that has nothing to do with a particular traumatic event like that. And it all can run the gamut. Statistically, the sad thing is that they say around 50% of the people who are dealing with depression and anxiety, which are the two most common sort of run-of-the-mill mental health issues, 50% of the people dealing with those issues in the United States go undiagnosed and untreated. That's a large pool of the population. And for many of those folks, the symptoms and the conditions actually started when they were children. We see kids at Children's Health a variety of ages. We're not talking just about maybe teenagers that you might expect who are 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, but oftentimes much younger children also are grappling with significant issues around anxiety and depression. For most people, they may not progress beyond the sort of moderate range, but that doesn't mean they aren't significant or serious, or that they can't build upon themselves over time. And maybe by those teenage years or by their 20s or 30s, things build up to a point and escalate to a stage where there's a crisis. And they show up and try to start dealing with those mental health issues for the first time in an emergency room. It is shocking to see the number of kids in the emergency department here at Children's Health every day right now. It is absolutely mind-boggling. Already in 2021, we've seen as many kids having a mental health crisis in the emergency room as we saw during the entire year of 2020. We've got 3 months yet to go. And that is, again, a trend line that didn't just start during these last 2 years. You know, it's been growing over time. The startling statistic that usually gets people's attention is that for kids that are age 15 up to sort of young adulthood around 24, the CDC reports now that suicide is the second leading cause of death for that age group, 15 to 24. And rarely does that happen as a sudden event, right? There's a buildup to that point. So something is definitely going on with our kids.
Okay, so you said that you were going to get to a more startling statistic. I've already found 3 statistics that are startling. First is that 50% of depression is undiagnosed and untreated. The second is that your numbers have increased so dramatically year over year. And the third is the suicide rate is the second leading cause. Those are all collectively, terrible statistics. But let me see if we can kind of go one layer down. And I'm going to try and do this in a way that uses layman's terms and layman's definitions for what could be medical characterizations. So I kind of think about things in cognitive or functional brain activity or mental health. Then there's what I would call psychological versions of that, or mental health issues. And then there are what I call emotional mental health issues. And so the way I think about it, and I'm obviously a layman here, but the cognitive issues relate to brain functionality. And I know you have a relationship with the Brain Health Center. I would think that that's a whole set of problems that's unique into itself. Then there's the middle category is psychological, which is the way I think about it, how your decisions are made from an intellectual and an emotional, a combination of those two things. And there's an emotional reaction, which is you just have emotional reactions to things, which are likely linked to some form of triggering event or triggering a triggered response. Is that an okay framework to think about things as you're seeing them on the front line, or is it unhelpfully detailed?
I don't know that it's a bad way to think about it. I'm not being a clinician. I can't tell you the way a pediatric psychologist or a pediatric psychiatrist would necessarily frame that. I think of it in terms of a spectrum of severity, okay. And those characteristics.
What is it? What are the complications? Meaning the output you're having to deal with. Yeah, I get that. Okay.
And somewhat rooted in the underlying genesis of the issue, where you can look at sort of mild to moderate levels of anxiety and depression, maybe at one end of that spectrum. And then you move all the way to the other end of that spectrum, and you've got very significant things that have a strong genetic basis that may manifest themselves at a later point in time, like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, those types of mental health issues. And then this huge spectrum in between, where you have things like autism and mood disorders and different types of dependencies and dependent behavior that may lead to drug and alcohol addiction and those kinds of things, and a whole range of eating disorders and a variety of things that stretch across that spectrum. The reality is that most kids that are facing a mental health issue, as I understand it, fall predominantly on that low end of acuity side of the spectrum. And a relatively small number of kids wind up on the high acuity end, dealing with something like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. Now, if a child is going to be dealing with bipolar disorder, they're going to need intensive therapy and care, and they're going to need the best healthcare professionals that are available to provide that care to them. And it will be an intensive amount of resources. But that's a relatively small number of people compared to the whole. Most kids these days are dealing with anxiety and depression at that opposite end of the scale. And yet, as you alluded to, most of them are not getting flagged early on for struggling with those issues. And so they fester and they progress over time and build and compound to a point where the child has to ultimately then reach a breaking point, and there's a dramatic crisis that forces everybody typically into the emergency room. And let me just say, Todd, that the last place you want to go to initiate mental health care for anybody, much less a kid, is into the emergency room of a big medical center. I mean, that is a place that provides high acuity care at a moment of crisis, and that's what it is there for. But that's not an ideal place to assess the long-term mental health needs and to try to address them with everything else that's going on in an emergency room.